and testimony this morning. Once again, I'd like to thank you for our second meeting here. Thank you for your commitment to the state and your leadership. And I think those that watch some of the testimony tomorrow, that's just kind of the beginning of a process here that's going to run for the next 15 months. And thank you for your participation. We have three members today that were not at our first meeting. So I'd like to take a brief moment to have Jerry and Robert and Terry introduce themselves, and just with a quick bio for the rest of the committee. So you want to start with Terry?
Yeah. Oh, hi. I'm Terry.
It's 15 months, and thank you for your participation.
I have 30 years experience working in proprietary education and nonprofit organizations, working with the adult learner and helping them get job skills and get back into the workplace.
Robert, you want to go?
Bob Ferguson, Corpus Christi, 14 years as president of Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. I also was subsequently the executive director of the Heart Research Institute there. Came from Nebraska, where I was the vice chancellor for academic affairs at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln.
Jerry?
I was president at Texas Wesleyan for 7 years, and I was president at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor for 18 years, and spent 3 years as chancellor after that. Now I'm retired, sort of.
Right.
And I'm Martin Bascadula. I've served on the coordinating board in the past, also on my community college board in Houston, and physician in Houston.
Right. Thank you, Martin. The coordinating board staff has set up a website for our work. So has that been distributed to everybody? Do they have the?
They don't have the URL.
Okay. Wanda, if you could do that. Yeah. Okay. Also, Mary has asked and Jennifer has asked that for you to check your bio that's on the website, and if there's any corrections or additions, they'll be glad to receive those. As you know, our committee is charged with providing to the coordinating board advice. I mean, we are advisory and recommendations regarding the board's development of the next long-term strategic plan for Texas higher education. For our meeting today, each of you should have at your place the agenda, the minutes from our March 3rd minutes, or the minutes from our March 3rd meeting. We've already had our small group discussions. After the approval of the minutes, we will then go into a discussion of our small group breakout sessions. And so with that, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
All right, made and second. Any opposed? None opposed. Minutes pass. So now I'd like to turn it over to the coordinating board staff and whoever we self-selected to report for the breakouts. Oh. Mary, did I catch you at the wrong time there?
Well, I was elected to report out for the group, so I'll go ahead and do that. We were Group 1, and our group consisted of James Anderson, Robert Ferguson, Woody Hunt, Shirley Richardson, and Terry Seufert. And we had two questions, as everyone else did. And the two questions were, well, the first question is, where do we want to see Texas in 2030? And so we began the discussion actually with Shirley Richardson, who would like Texas to lead the nation in K through 16 success. And she would like to have Texas walk the talk for our young children. She wants every child to know that they can succeed at whatever they'd like to be able to do, and that we need to start that dialogue early. James also agreed with that. He would also like to lead in graduates and workforce needs and in affordability. And Robert would like the same. He does say, though, that in order for Texas to be a leader, it's a big leap. So he would like to have incremental goals and make sure that we're not slipping behind. He also would like to make sure that we have the educational infrastructure that's necessary in order for students and our younger generation to succeed. he would like to have the appropriate infrastructure for the goal of the students. And there was some discussion about what the word appropriate meant. And while it still needs to be more fully refined and defined, the idea really is that it would be appropriate educational structure for the students on whatever they want to accomplish. So for example, if a student wanted to become a welder, that opportunity would be available to the student based on the educational infrastructure. We also do need to concern ourselves with adequate funding. Now, Mr. Hunt also agreed. He also said, though, that we need a political argument for a plan that would be able to have state support. He would like to have one overall goal in addition to whatever other goals that we come up with the plan. And he would very much like to see that we move to a focus on completion. He brought up the OECD as a potential benchmark. There was some discussion about that and how we would need to compare ourselves as a state and the kinds of questions that we would need to ask. There will be a handout coming out from a conversation that coordinating board staff had with Jeff Stroll of the university, the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, that Mr. Hunt has asked us to distribute to you in advance of the presentation that Jeff Stroll will be making via Skype to you all on the 22nd of May, as will Andrea Schleicher from the OECD. So there'll be a little preparation for that. But the overall goal that Mr. Hunt was talking about from the OECD is a 60% goal. It's understandable, it's simple, there's political support behind it, and some countries are actually embracing it to the point of becoming a rallying point for their actual nation. With respect to the 2030 goal overall, Terry would like to see us bridge the gap between higher education and the business community. She would like to see us value what students, what adults actually learn at work, and she would like to have the business community buy in and participate in the higher education enterprise. And there were some examples that she shared. We may need to do some international benchmarking. We may not necessarily want to discuss the international benchmarking because it is politically charged, but we do need to consider that and consider overall metrics to move us forward as a state and in the international front. With respect to the second goal, the second question, Mr. Hunt began that conversation by talking about the potential of having competitors by region. Higher education might be able to play a role in making a particular region more competitive. And he would also like to see that not only are we supplying students, but there is a demand for graduates with the educational credentials produced in that region for the graduates that actually come out. So basically, Mr. Hunt was arguing for not only considering the supply, but also the demand. How can higher education better connect with business on the demand side? And our the group's conversation began with how do we make an entrepreneurial environment and how do we make an innovative workforce for our potential workforce needs. And the other one was how can higher education play a role in more job creation for the region? And again, not only on the supply side. Robert talked about the success that his experience normally has the business and community behind the goal. So we need to get a plan that we can make sure that the business and community are behind the new strategic plan. She would like to value also, Terry would like to value what people learn at work. And then there's a conversation about certification. We need to, Mr. Hunt said, if we don't certify what we know, a lot of times that's not recognized. So we want to make sure that we have certifications in place that are reasonable for being recognized. There is a political cycle of 2 to 4 years, so we have to be careful that our plan, if it's going to be used politically, which it needs to be used politically, that our legislators can focus on something that will enable them within their 2 to 4 year cycles to move it forward on a political agenda also. Lots of different conversations were going on. And then finally, there was a discussion about connecting work with learning and how it's now kind of disconnected to a point, and how we need to incentivize that. We need to engage more with the community and business. Shirley Richardson focused on the partnerships that have already begun with the business and the educational side need to be better communicated. And Bob said that lone voices don't get too far. We need to be a chorus, and we need to organize and trigger that chorus. And there was some conversations about how higher education could help trigger that chorus. And one of the foci of our group was that one of the things that we might be able to utilize was the student engagement work that's being done right here at the University of Texas at Austin, and that we could maybe begin that chorus. And the parting focus of our group was that we need to consider it as a mosaic and not a checkerboard. So we're trying to make a mosaic for the state that would enable the state to move forward with the benefit of both business and education working together.
Thank you. David, one comment there is Dr. Schlechter, when he presents in May, is he going to pick up their work to answer that second question? In other words, they've done a lot of work worldwide on the question of what's the appropriate role of higher education in economic development, connecting to the workforce, et cetera.
Yeah, we can emphasize to him that he needs to address that at the time.
Yeah, I think that might be useful. I mean, I don't know if and not just talk about benchmarking, but be able to also be able to help answer the second question.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And one of the reasons we thought it was important to have this exercise today is it actually helps define some of the subsequent meetings, some of the types of experts we need to bring in and talk to you based upon some of the concerns that come up today. So that's a perfect example. So who is next?
Group 2.
Interestingly enough, we didn't really talk about politics being a challenge. That kind of didn't come up for whatever reason. We kind of went from talking about visionary on this level to kind of maybe getting into the weeds a little bit. And I think both sides of the discussion were really helpful. I think one of the major areas of concern was the STEM area. And when we talked about the science, technology, engineering, and math, and the fields and how that translates to the workforce, we talked a lot about community colleges and their impact on really being nimble and having that availability to adjust so that they do meet the needs of the workforce. We talked about blurring the distinction between K-12, community college, and four-year university so that it's more of a continuum, even to the point of eliminating 12th grade as we know it and looking at it as both developmental ed and visionary in preparing kids for sustainability in college. We discussed a little bit about closing the gaps and how we wanted to maybe continue that process and how successful that was in identifying and really tracing data and tracking data and being flexible as we reach different milestones and looking at that as a continuum. However, we also, and I'll attribute this to Dr. Faulkner's quote of eliminating the disparities in educational attainment and really looking more at a global comparison so that we're not just in the hunt of being, one of the educational states that's sort of kind of doing this better or that worse, but really looking at us internationally and globally and how we interact with the rest of the world and where we are as in educational attainment. And I think one of the things that we talked about a lot was whether it was geographic or racial or ethnic or whatever, that it's really a lot about socioeconomics and looking at, and we brought up like in urban districts across the state, we're looking at least 80% and sometimes more in poverty, and looking at not only the availability of education in the closing the gaps, it would be, the very first part, and that's, the participation, but just as importantly, if not more so, in the success side of really making them college and career ready. It was brought up about the two-year universities being like a pivotal point or a centerpiece for making that happen into the workforce students into technical skills, and how the workforce needs to be an integral part of what we're doing. So much of what we, and I say we, all of us look at, whether policymakers or educators or workforce or community leaders, we're looking at workforce sometimes in, like, what can you do? Can you throw money at this? Or, how can you really be meaningful? We talked a lot about internships and what that looks like as far as all students being identified, much like they do in law school. If you're in law school, you have an internship each year, and that kind of prepares you for your track. If you're a student teacher going through the educational process, but what does that look like for a lot of the others? That how are we preparing them for being accepted, hired, and being productive citizens in the workplace? We mentioned the Hope Scholarship, and I know that at Texas Grants, if money were no object, every single solitary child or student would have loan forgiveness. But we talked about businesses contributing toward loan forgiveness and the business involvement in that, and how, like in Georgia, that every single student that graduates with whatever it is, a B average, can get that free tuition. Let's see. One term I thought was interesting was removing polarization, and I thought that was pretty impactful. Preparedness, removing the disparity, stronger advisory, so that every student that's in college, and I noticed, Mary, with a lot of the STAR Awards, almost every single solitary year, those premier programs look at advising and holding hands of students to make them successful, make sure they're successful, and not just kind of fall through the cracks. We talked about avoiding student loans and looking at other ways so that students don't have that heavy loan burden when they graduate. I said about this statewide scholarship program. I want to make sure I have everything. We talked a lot about the early college program. We have two experts on our group subcommittee that are experts in community college leadership, and we talked about the early college and the dual credit, and how that, looking into the future, what that's going to look like. That students graduating from high school, more and more, it's the norm, and that students would be prepared and have like an associate's degree or close to it when they enter college, which removes the horrible burden of student loans. Let's see, loan forgiveness, industry internships, I talked about that. We talked about Canada and their percentage of associate degrees and four-year degrees as compared to the United States. We talked about how some of the countries across the world are maybe not the ones we should compare ourselves to, but Canada would be an effective one because of our more similar socioeconomic and diversity. We talked about a future vision where it's not a classroom with a teacher standing in the front, but some sort of a real world evolving universe of learning, as opposed to the traditional learning that probably all of us are most used to. And I'd like to invite the committee to add anything that I might have missed. Yes, Dr. Faulkner.
I might add something. Actually, I think Laurie contributed, since she's bypassed it, which is that as we look out to 2030, that in a large measure that we need to think about preparing students for a future we can't predict and for jobs that don't yet exist. There is a lot of truth to that, and so I think fundamental versatility is a very important outcome. Or what we shoot for.
Okay, and the third group? Who's going to present?
Unfortunately, I didn't.
All right, Susan.
I'm not a late yet. Too well.
Late, so we didn't get around to that. So we talked a lot about the 60% and how do you measure it, because there's is it workforce, is it total population? How do you measure that? So that was one of the things we talked about on where we want the state to be. I also talked about how to measure that certificates. We also talked about the need for more research, because research does drive a lot of the needs in the state, the research and bringing in new businesses can start from research and bringing in additional funding. So that was another one of the things that we talked about. We talked about the connection between K-12, and a lot of the other two groups have talked about that. We talked about that connection needing elementary school, higher ed, all to be one continuum and not to see those break points. Mr. Francis brought up the K-14 aspect. If we just say K-14, it's just that assumption that takes away those break points. And that was a big thing. We talked about making sure we had parents involved. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. Set high expectations. We talked about, we kind of got into the little weeds a little bit. We talked about the dual credit in the early college high schools are a really good way of making sure that students understand that they can do the work and that they have that expectation. And that gets almost to the affordability that if you have them graduating from high school with quite a few hours, they're much more likely to go on to higher ed. It's going to cost them less. It's going to move them through the pipeline. So that was discussed quite a bit. We talked about some of the gender bias, gender-based education, and trying to get the genders in alignment. These were just some other ideas. Parent-student portal that followed them from elementary school all the way through the process to kind of make that application to higher ed easier, to make it kind of a smoother transition so that there would be things that they would be asked all the way through starting in K-12 to help the parents and the students work together to get ready for to enroll in higher ed, to get them going all the way through the process there. We also talked about the importance of trades and the technical education, and we need to, and this was if we live in the perfect world, so if we could just wave our little wand and be in the perfect world, that then we would have the ability to show that the trades are important. We talk about weldings and needing technicians and that sort of thing, and that it needs to have a certain importance and people to understand how important that is. We talked about some of the programs that we have that build on top of each other from a certificate to associate degree and then to a bachelor's, and having that continuum be available to students. And for kind of going back to a bigger goal, we wanted to have every student prepared and motivated to get some type of post-secondary education. We felt like if we had all the students in K-12 prepared and motivated, the rest of it would somewhat take care of itself. Now, that is a huge challenge in itself, but if you do that, you're going to be fine. This is the ABE. We talked the clawback, getting those students who have dropped out either at the high school level or dropped out at the college or never went to college, but getting them back into the education pipeline to make sure we have a whole lot of adults that are not, literate. So if we can get them back through and into the program and into certification programs and that sort of stuff, that will go a long way into helping in a lot of different areas. We need to close the gender gaps. We talked a lot about the males not attending college at the same rate as females and not completing at the same rate as females. So the gender gap, they are more likely to drop out of high school. They're more likely to not enroll in higher ed. They're more likely to not finish higher ed once they enroll. So that was a big thing. And we talked about competency-based, and a lot of things are going that way, toward more and more competency-based. So, you may have a student who can complete, 3/4 of a course. Do they really need to sit through 3/4 of that course again, or can they just complete the other two and keep moving forward and keep moving? And in some ways, dual credit kind of does that for those better prepared students. They're not getting bored in high school. They can move on in a certain way. They can move on into college and start working on their college degree. So it's not necessarily competency-based as far as taking a test and being able to understand, but it helps them move on through the pipeline a little faster. And so those are kind of what we talked about, and I'm going to let the group chime in if there's something I missed.
Yes, David.
One comment and a couple of observations, if I might. Number one, Raymond wanted to make sure that you all knew he was sorry he couldn't be here. He continues to have the family issues he has to deal with in terms of health, and so I can assure you he'd much rather be here. My observations. Very quickly, I've been through this type of process a lot, and you've obviously had some good discussions. But one thing I would observe is you've assumed a future for Texas in your discussions, but you haven't really stated what you think that future should be. And it's embedded in what you're doing, but I think that you need to put a little thought into that. And I think Dr. Faulkner's remark coming out of his group may have some bearing on that, is you're preparing students for a future we can't predict, which says something about the type of Texas you want to have and the type of people that would be there, but you haven't explicitly stated that. You've also done something that all of us always do. It's natural to go to solutions of assumed goals. And most of your discussions today were solutions to goals you haven't set yet. And they may be where you end up, but I just alert to you that you have to be aware of that. You need to be conscious of it. It's much harder to do these other things. What should the state look like? How should higher ed contribute? That helps you identify your goals. We're assuming the 60% goal in terms of the workforce. That may be exactly where you end up, but you still have to think about how that fits into the state you want, and even in terms of how does higher education contribute to that. There's ways it will contribute and things that it cannot, and it's important to separate those things out in some ways, even if it ends up in the plan. That's my one comment. It's a real challenge, and I can tell you this will not be the first time. We're probably going to hope that you will talk about this. This will be your first pass today, and from walking around from group to group, the conversations were very interesting, I think, and I think the summaries were good. But I just pass it back to you, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you. Well, I do think the comment that we need to focus on goals, first to get some idea of what, and that allows us to project, or requires us to project forward. I guess my own comment is one data point I saw recently that I thought was interesting, and in kind of a geopolitical sense, is the world's population. If you go back 30, 40 years, about 20% of it was in a competitive, capitalistic economies. Today, that number is well over 90%. So essentially, we've got this globalization, this competition for resources, competition, both physical and human resources. So I think we need to make an assumption, and one of those assumptions is that's not going to change. In other words, we are going to have this ongoing competitive environment, which there are few protections against, and so other than being well educated. So as an individual, your education levels is really your differentiator and a indicator of how well educated you're going to be. And the same is true of a family as it is of an individual or a political unit, including a city or a region or a state. So I think we need to, whatever we come up with as goals, need to take into recognition that things are going to change, and if the change could be more rapid than what it has been historically, it's going to be competitive, and we need to, if we're going to benchmark ourselves, maybe we need to benchmark ourselves on a competitive scale, and when we start picking absolutes, as we did in 2000, 5.7% was our goal of the population. Maybe 60% today falls into that same category. In other words, it's maybe more important for us to design a future where we want to be able to participate and we want to be competitive and get our fair share of through competition of world resources, world income, world GDP, per capita. But at least I would throw that out. But I welcome any other dialogue right now around this issue. Particularly, I think would be informative for the staff to kind of know who we would like to hear from. We do have the Georgetown Center, Workforce Center, which is kind of the preeminent center on research around the future workforce and what kind of educational attainment will be required to participate in that workforce. And then also the OECD, which has been the leader for benchmarking, but also a leader in defining what's the role of higher education in an economy, particularly a regional economy. Yes, Larry.
I thought I sat through that OECD presentation in this room whenever it was, a year ago.
Yeah, about a year ago.
It was really informative, and it might be actually pretty beneficial for this group to
So
go
we've-
through something like that.
Right, and we've got that scheduled for our May meeting, so I encourage everybody to be here, because I agree that we're hearing with the two preeminent sources today that are trying to answer some of the questions that we're struggling with or we're raising today. But I'd like to hear from the group as far as who else might they like to hear from? And that's, I mean, we still got budget issues that we got to work on, but we'd like to make, to try to get the best and the brightest anywhere in the world. And sometimes we can do that, as we're going to do in May, in an inexpensive manner to help inform us as far as what our vision should be.
On the board and stuff.
Yes.
We're just asking her to sort of do her best to sort of keep up with your point, so at the end of the day, we can make sure we summarize things correctly. So if you see these going up, don't worry about them. You don't have to agree with them now, but we want to make sure we're keeping track of the key words from what people are saying.
Yes, go ahead.
Another point I'd like to make or suggest relative to who we might hear from is, I do believe, I mean, as you've heard from the testimony I gave today and other comments I've made, that one of the places where I think we can make some hay is to dramatically improve the high school to college transition. That's a lot easier said than done, but there are people who are working on things. I also made the point in our session today that I believe that affordability is an issue, cost of delivery is an issue. I personally think that if we were to really work the high school to college transition well, we might be able to eliminate as much of a year of the educational path. And that would save some real money for a lot of people. I wonder if we could get, I don't know who these people are that we need to hear from. I'm suggesting that David and his colleagues might be thoughtful about that, but is there a set of people who know a lot about what options exist for experimentation in, early college, high school? I mean, early college and high school is an example, but it's not the only example. But who could talk to us about that? I'm not saying you have to give us those names right now, but I'd say a session that deals with what has been tried might be worth sitting through.
Yes, Laurie.
I would agree, and I think any of our college chancellors throughout the state have successful programs. I can think of several of them that do. But I also think, and I don't know the names of these people that we've had speak that are futurists, that really drive focus in a focused manner toward what education should look like and what we currently have done for the last 100 years that hasn't changed, and what needs to change to prepare us for this workforce that we don't even know what jobs there will be. So I think maybe a futurist. I can send you names. I don't know anybody in particular, but kind of to set the stage. And I was also thinking about Rod Page, because having been a superintendent, having been a college dean, and having been Secretary of Ed, I think his perspective. He's the one that said, as a black man, he said that education is a great equalizer. It's not about race, it's about education. It's not about socioeconomics, it's about education. I think that might give us a really good framework. It's just a thought.
I think that this improving the high school college transition is key. Early to have. And this is what Jerry Maskey brought up in our group, to have every student prepared and motivated to be college and career ready. And I think there's one fella that is doing a particularly good job in the Dallas area. He's a superintendent. His name is David Vincent, and he has this just ability to get all the students, all of the parents motivated and bring in the community in a very exciting way and so forth. So that would be one name that I might suggest.
One of the things that I've in talking to people that are in community colleges and four-year colleges is that the way that education is produced is changing very rapidly in terms of online education and distance learning and the way that courses are really taken. And I guess I don't quite understand totally where that's going or how fast that's occurring, but I suspect that's occurring faster than any of us think that it's happening. And how would that then affect the way that we would be thinking about some of the programs that are being done in state?
Let me suggest a couple things just so you'll be aware of it. Next week, our board meeting's next week. Our major policy issue will be discussing specifically where we stand in terms of delivery methods right now. So essentially trying to lay a benchmark. We'll start with Van Davis from our staff. Will point out, for example, that a lot of people will be surprised to learn that in a given semester we probably have 400,000 students taking online education, one course at least. A lot of people don't realize that. But setting the benchmark for where that exists. Then I was just trying to look up the date. We'll get it to you. In July, we have a one-day program focusing on new delivery systems, which is using money sponsored by the Houston Endowment. I can say thanks to Dr. Faulkner when he was there.
I think it's my successor.
When he was there. Well, but we were thinking about possibly, I'm not sure what date we had set for you then, but at any rate, we would like to give you the opportunity to attend that meeting because we will have experts into that meeting. And it will all be taped, of course, as will our major policy issue next week. But we're looking for opportunities where we already have things planned to make sure you take full advantage. And we'll get you all that information right away. We can get that to you before the week's over when those occur, the July meeting.
Yes.
I just make a point. I think all three of the groups indicated we need to foster this interaction between business and the higher education. If there's an entity or a group who could speak with us about perhaps ways that business would be likely to interact with and support higher education, or the interaction between the two, I think that would be helpful, whether it's on-the-job training, getting credit for on-the-job training, whether it's providing tuition rebates to students who go to college. But if there's some business or some entity that deals with that, I think that would be helpful as well.
And it occurs to me, Mr. Hunt, that when we were talking about Andreas and Georgetown, that you might want to add to that meeting if we could get him, the Commissioner Alcantar, to talk from the standpoint of the Workforce Commission in Texas, to hear that voice. They're doing a lot of things. If not at that meeting, another one. Because we can talk internationally, we can talk the U.S., but we probably need to have that state impact as well, and then look for someone specifically like you're referencing, maybe if not that meeting, another. So we will be looking out for
right. So why don't we see then what our timeline is and whether we can fit three of them onto a meeting or not. I mean, one observation would also have, and it's a conclusion I came to after a long time being engaged in higher education, which is kind of our mandate here, is that to a large extent we're held hostage by the outcomes of the K through 12 system. So it kind of gets back to Larry's point of the transition, but it might even be, it becomes a K through 16 system, and that's the pipeline. And if the pipeline is not working anywhere, not only at the transition between what we call high school and higher ed, if it's not working at the earlier grades, so at what point do we draw the line here and say, well, we don't want to go there as far as testimony or trying to understand the challenges that we have? In other words, if we know the pipeline has to be, if we want to raise our goals looking forward, we know that the pipeline has to be much more productive. It'd be nice to turn it on at the 12th grade and accomplish everything that we want to do, but I think evidence tells us that maybe the problem is deeper and longer standing than that, and do we need to delve into that or not? But David, what is your opinion, or open it up to the committee?
I think it's important to hear from the committee. I do think that's a fine line that you're going to have to play in terms of ensuring that you still have a higher ed plan and that you don't focus so much on earlier than the transition that you miss what higher ed should do. And one thing in terms of that issue that you may want to talk about at some point, do institutions of higher ed understate the importance of their role in terms of teacher preparation of administrators, counselors. These are all people that were prepared by our institutions that are out in the schools that play an important role, and they tend not to be the most important areas on most of our campuses. So that fits into way higher ed can directly contribute beyond just those transitions. But this is ultimately your committee, so
yeah. Yes, Laurie.
I think if I had one criticism of the K-12 or the higher ed boards that I've served on, it would be that they tend to exist in a vacuum too often. And I think they need to be intertwined, and I think that we do need to walk a fine line, but it can't be. We can't make goals for higher education and the workforce in a vacuum without looking at K-12 or P-12. And I think, however, we all feel is appropriate, we need to be mindful of that. If you go to any higher ed meeting, you see very few K-12 people. If you go to any K-12 conference or meeting, you see very few higher ed people. And I think that that's probably a part of the problem as far as creating a pipeline when there's many different pipelines that don't ever coexist.
If real quickly, the commissioner mentioned, and it fits in here, so I want to insert it, that if he had been at the hearing today, he would have mentioned the possibility of requiring vertical teams in Texas in terms of people in the public schools and higher education working together on an ongoing basis.
That's why I suggested Rod Page, because he has been on both sides of it, and Secretary of Ed, is because he's seen both sides of it. And we can't dictate any more than we could dictate to a university. We certainly can't dictate to K-12. But I think that if we keep in mind the challenges and try and figure out attainable goals for both and figure out the appropriate way to work with all of the entities, that would be a lot more successful. And in tribute to Kathy and Martin, when you all were doing Closing the Gaps, you did that, and I think that was what made Closing the Gaps so successful. And the other piece of Closing the Gaps was that it was, I keep using that word nimble. It's not even a word I usually use, but I've used it 3 times today. Anyway, but flexible. We've continued to look at being flexible throughout Closing the Gaps when the goals were just barely out of reach but yet attainable. And then when all of a sudden we realized we could raise those goals and make them even more stringent and more strenuous, I think that was a healthy thing, and you guys made that possible.
Well, Martin made it possible, but I do want to talk about, if you don't have shared visions, if you don't have shared motivations, and you don't have shared accountability, it's nobody's job. So yes, the Texas legislature says this board is charged with, and hence this committee that grew out of the board. But in essence, to say that we can come up with a plan and we want to be accountable because we want the progress, but all we have is outreach, informal partnerships, love thy neighbor, no skin in the game. At least in the private sector, that's not how you move forward to achieve goals. So somehow we may just have to have a couple of mature grown-up disclaimers on our report.
Yes, Robert, go ahead. Well, I was trying to look at the big picture and excuse me, wondering that, we're talking a lot about the workforce of the future, but I wonder if we don't also have to look at our internal workforce. And I'm thinking about, Kathy used the word motivator. I really see the faculty of the future having primarily a responsibility for motivation and interpretation, but not just recitation. And I think somehow we're going to have to, as a industry, to look at our own workforce in here, and is it appropriate for getting this new group of students into our general workforce in here and having them motivated by our faculties and so on. So I don't know whether there's an organization that is out there that's kind of studying the dynamics of our faculties and our own internal workforces, but I'd certainly be interested in that if there were.
Yes.
You triggered a thought there, but to the point on public education versus higher education, I understand your caveat, but I do think that they're tied together. I wish higher education had been more involved in the discussions on House Bill 5. We had some talk about that in our group. I know Commissioner Paredes testified on it and was around quite a bit, but I think the unfortunate reality with the changes in the graduation standards and the accountability at the public ed level is that a lot of the metrics on the performance of House Bill 5 are going to be at the higher education level. It's going to be SAT performance, remediation costs, how many kids get through. So I think we may want to consider in relation to the public ed system, alignment is very, very important, but also looking at and really planning for looking at those factors and building those metrics in to better understand the impact of what's happening in public ed on the performance of higher ed. So,
Woody?
Yes. Shirley.
In talking about people we might want to hear as resource people, if we get back to piggyback on what Lionel said, there are some exemplary models out there, some P16 councils and some school districts that are doing remarkable things with the whole pipeline, workforce through community college through four-year college. I think of one, and that's the Waco superintendent, Dr. Bonnie Kane. Very diverse school district. The young man you mentioned. I don't know if the committee would be interested in a short overview from them of what they are doing, what is working, or if you could have just someone from a model P16 council, because the good P16 councils are very inclusive. It's not just pub ed and higher ed. All the workforce folks in that community are there talking about what does the future look like? What are we going to need? And how do we get there? I know they're doing that in Waco with Dr. Bonnie Kane and Baylor and the manufacturing, things that they're trying to bring back in to rebuild Waco and do a carpe diem there with Baylor and some of those other universities. I don't know that that would be of interest to you if you had a dynamic superintendent come and say, guys, here's what we're doing. But there really is a strong connection. In the school districts I'm familiar with, they are working hand in hand with higher ed. There's not a disconnect. When you are looking at the early college, high school program, that can't be done in a vacuum. That has to be done with the community colleges, the workforce, and the higher ed. So it's working out there. And with our P16 councils, with dual credit, and so many kids are graduating with their associate's degree. I think you might be surprised at how much we are really doing. It's just we don't really toot our horns well enough. Maybe it's not clear communicated. And then TEA, they're experts. They have experts with the data, because I know the data drives decisions and the data speaks volumes. But if you could get perhaps one of the experts there to talk about what we're doing in that vein, David, I don't know if that would be of interest or not. But when I was commissioner of Pub Ed and Raymond, we spent our time pulling the two agencies together, telling people, this has to be locally. Everything can't be top down all the time. Granted, you have to have accountability, you have to have standards, and we're all very supportive of standards. But at the end of the day, those local communities have got to pick up the ball and run with it. They've got to do the work. We can legislate, mandate all day long. But I just know there are some models that are remarkable, and give them 20 minutes and say, just in a nutshell, show us what you're doing that's working. I don't know, you may not even be interested in that, just toss it out there.
I think that's good.
Yes, Larry.
Let me follow up what Shirley just said about localities. I think as we talk about this interface between K-12 and higher ed, I don't think we can think about it in terms of our going back into the K-12 system sort of systematically having any effect on its structure so much, unless we can drive it through incentives on our side. I think that there are possibilities in some of the things we were talking about streamlined education passing through the senior year of high school and meshing well with college so you could eliminate a whole year. I mean, things like that could generate a demand from the K-12 system that would be helpful. But the thing I would like to follow up with about Shirley is this, that we can't forget that there are really two completely different political realities with respect to these two systems. K-16 is run locally. Control of it is local. And in the end, what level they achieve when they graduate from high school is decided locally. Higher ed is mostly responsive to a national scope accreditation system that is not responsive to local politics and or even to state politics. So what you have is you have this intrinsic disconnect with kids coming out of a public system that has all this local definition, going into a higher ed system that is nationally and even internationally defined. It's amazing that it's not a more serious discrepancy. My position is that we can't stand around waiting for this system to connect perfectly with us. What we need to do on the higher ed side is we have to take greater responsibility for getting kids as they emerge, however they emerge, from the K-16 system or K-12 system into an effective ability to pursue college level work.
Well, Larry,
for the most part, we have disregarded that task. There are, I don't want to say there aren't some serious programs. There are some serious programs. But by and large, we have dealt with that issue grudgingly, if at all. We haven't really professionalized it. We haven't really put a serious research base on it. We haven't learned how to do it. But partly it's because we don't want to do it. We'd rather have the K-12 system do it. Well, what I'm saying is that I think it's very important for this committee to recognize the differences in political reality on the K-12 side, very locally determined and not going to change anytime soon. And the higher ed side means that disconnect is always there, and we're going to have to, on our side, we're going to have to work with it, and we're going to have to work with it better than we ever have. That's my point.
Larry, I just wanted to clarify one thing, is that if I remember your testimony correctly, you said there are more dropouts in college than there are in high school.
That's correct.
I think that is an issue that, you can do something about, because, again, it's something that's more internal to us than these interfaces that you've been talking about.
And that's roughly 1/3 of a whole age cohort.
I do believe that there is I don't know whether reform is the right word, but there's a reform element largely driven by the business community, expressed in Houston, Larry, by the Houston Partnership. Dallas is now the Dallas Council and a group called Dallas Commit. San Antonio has Choose to Succeed. They're dealing with K through 12 in different ways. Some are more focused on choice and some are more focused on reform within the public institutions. But I think some of the same economic pressures that we're looking at higher education and trying to decide how do we increase the productivity is also going to be, even though it's locally driven, is emerging. And because the same tensions there of not having a competitive workforce is causing the pressure to change. Like that. So now whether one will change faster than the other and how do we communicate is probably some open questions there. David, would it be worthwhile to have
David, he's like,
to have Commissioner Williams visit with us or others? I mean, just so that we don't. I think there's kind of a consensus building that K through 12 is kind of outside our mandate here, but do we need to be better informed on the connection between the two and what is possible?
Yeah, I didn't hear that people were saying that it's outside the role. I thought, well, part of what I heard from Dr. Faulkner was, while we can't address all that, we have to be willing to, whoever's developed, be able to help them succeed at that point.
Yeah.
But not to ignore necessarily anything before that point. I think it could be helpful. I think, the worlds are somewhat different, and I think the agencies are even somewhat different in terms of the nature of them, and so I think it could be helpful to hear something. We can work with you to develop that. Susan had mentioned to me when some of the things that are going on were mentioned. We know that San Jacinto College and some of the school superintendents are doing some really great things. We actually have, and you'll know about this, some P-16 councils that have also been very effective. Some have not been at all, and it might be useful if we identified one that has been.
Well, Strive is part of the national network that was started by the University of Cincinnati, and now Nancy Zimpher is the is the chancellor of the SUNY system. And Houston has the Strive network. It's called All Kids Alliance, and San Antonio has an amazing one, and so does Austin and Dallas. Actually, we stole our ideas from El Paso from years ago, but if the truth be known. And Arlington, there was an Arlington program that was pretty amazing. But I would think that it would be more effective if we had a superintendent that could really talk, and maybe a community college chancellor that have a relationship with the early college from wherever. It could be, Alamo, and that would be probably a really effective one. The Alamo chancellor and one of the superintendents that has and maybe someone from the workforce that has a really good symbiotic relationship with early college and that transition from high school. And I think that, we need to be real careful. We can't tell K-12 or P-12 what to do. But on the other hand, the decisions that we're making in setting goals for this state and higher ed have everything to do with what they're trying to do, the graduates that they're producing to go into our university. So I think that might give us a perspective if we had maybe, I would suggest the 3 from San Antonio with your San Antonio P16 Plus, I think it's called.
I think that continues something that was in Closing the Gaps, and I think there's some things that haven't fully realized their potential yet. But at the same time, I think the notion about perhaps some, if not a majority of higher education, grudgingly addresses students who aren't as adequately prepared as they should be is something that is worth addressing fully. I mean, I've personally thought for a long time, if I were one of the regional universities, one of the things I could be proudest of is industry knew I took in students that weren't that well prepared and everyone wanted to hire them when they were done. That would be something to be incredibly proud of. And I think there's that potential for many, many of our institutions in Texas to do that, because it's not as though many of these same students don't have the potential. They just haven't been given all the tools they need at that point, and we can't waste those students.
I've thought of a word we've not used today that we used to use so often in P16 communication, the word seamless, so that there wasn't this gap, that it was a very nice flowing seamless from PK-12 right into higher ed. And the purpose of the P16 councils were to open that dialogue and talk about what do we need to do to make this transition seamless. and have a very high graduation rate in higher ed. And of course, increase pub ed. But I can remember just simple examples coming from higher ed down to pub ed. Would you guys look at Princeton Review? Would you guys look at Avid? Absolutely. When we combine those programs with our regular early high school, it was amazing. And our other college prep programs, whether they were going for a 4-year college degree to an institutional technology school, or even the military, they left with some skills beyond high school that were phenomenal. Cornell note-taking, I think of that. Just ways to automatically hit the ground running because the teaching styles are so different from pub ed to higher ed. You talk about a disconnect. There's the disconnect. It's big. But there are things we can do. So, and Avid and Princeton Review are just two of them. Oh, there's a million more. And I'm trying to think, David, of the program that we had at T. I want to say Project Achieve was the one we developed with the workforce to make sure we had like the manufacturing skills in the medical profession, making sure, are we seeing a critical shortage of RNs, LVNs, radiologists? Where are those shortages? And you look at, and we use the term regional today. Woody talked a lot about regional with the OCD, the regional aspect, and that's where it becomes very localized and very personalized. What are the needs from here today to 2013 in given community or city or region, or what do you want to do? And how are we going to be prepared and ready for that together so that it's seamless and we produce those workers, we produce those professions, and we do it together through it.
Shirley, you've mentioned a number of times the K through 16, councils, and I think David commented some work better than others. Do we have an organization there, a structure, or a representative that could come and give us a kind of a state of the K through 16 councils, since they seem to be an important tool here in trying to better integrate?
We could definitely find someone to bring in to address that.
Yeah.
Can you talk to Bob Wimpelberg?
Sure.
Okay.
He's still in Houston? Yeah, I assume.
And Lori, do you think someone from Strive would make it? I mean, that would just be an example. Huh? Oh, that's, yeah.
Yeah, he is the executive director of All Kids Alliance in Houston,
Okay.
which is sponsored by the University of Houston, but that is our P16 umbrella.
But he's also a Strive organization?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, All Kids Alliance is a Strive organization.
That might be interesting. I mean, we're
Nancy
bringing a chapter to El Paso.
Yeah, Nancy
as well.
Zimfer's the executive director of Strive nationally, and she's at SUNY. That'd be cool. Mm-hmm. Or maybe both of them.
Okay.
No, she's not the executive. She's the founder, the executive director. I can't remember his name. But Bob Wimpelberg, former dean at U of H, College of Ed.
Well, maybe the Houston, I mean, just because you've got really K through 16 represented there, and then the Strive organization would be someone who could kind of inform us on how the two fit together. Yes, Terry.
Yes, I don't know.
Just push,
Okay,
and
there
it'll
I
turn
am.
red.
I just wanted to make one quick comment about the seamless approach. The state of Tennessee did exactly that. I don't have any of the specifics, but I'd be happy to get that information and send it so it could be on the website. But the state of Tennessee did create a statewide seamless process for students if they went to a community college at San Jac and then transferred to Alamo and then went into a 4-year university, so that the student wasn't penalized in any way, didn't lose credits, saved on tuition, and made it very beneficial for the students. So I'd be happy to get that information and send it to the website. Thank you.
Yes, Bernie.
Thank you, Woody. As I've been listening, it just dawned on me that the attainment process is a voluntary process. And so a lot of our discussion has to do with if you would improve the attainment process, that they will come, that they will attain. And I'm just wondering, maybe the carrot will work, but is there a stick component to to making this all happen? I don't know. I'm just asking the question, and that's why I favor K-14, by the way. But we keep talking about make things more collaborative, make it more exciting. Back in my generation, of course, there was a lot of shame in certain areas of lackluster performance. But today, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, you can drop out of school and be okay in your community, in your household. You can do other things that were frowned upon back then. So, what role does the whip play? I did take a note on that too. I said for the employers. I'm sorry. And that was salary increases and promotions. They could play a role in that regard. You've got to attain a certain level of academic performance in order to get a promotion, in order to get a raise. But I just thought we might want to think about the stick.
Right. Well, I mean, we did have a discussion in the testimony this morning with the Senate committee around completion funding. And so in a sense, if you wanted to, I'd like to describe it as an incentive, but you could also call it a stick in the sense that if you're being paid for performance, and performance as an institution is measured in completions, and even though the formula might pay you more for certain completions, STEM or at-risk students, than others, it's still essentially a stick in that sense. So I think that's policy that's happening, as it was testimony this morning, probably not been in place long enough to measure what the outcomes are. So I mean, is it best practices? I mean, but that's certainly if you want to view incentives as being a stick, then in an institutional sense, and also incentives can be, as the coordinating board knows, in changing the Texas grants a couple of years ago to essentially allow those that were better prepared to go to the front of the line because the probability of them actually completing was like 2 to 1. So it was essentially a big payoff on state money. But that was a stick to those that would have gotten to the front of the line without being better prepared. So, I mean, I think incentives would be my way of describing something that I would certainly believe should be a part of the toolkit to improve in productivity. Okay, we're right on schedule. Anybody else have any more comments around our discussions before I turn it over to Susan for her presentation?
Okay. I just would suggest that we didn't really get to
have a break?
The state. What you think it ought to be, or higher ed's contribution. So we will take what you've done and try to construct some short statements to that for your next meeting, and I'm sure you won't agree with it, but we'll start from there.
Right, and it might be instructive, in 6 months or so, to do this again after we've listened to a lot of external structure. And
you'll definitely have to. And just as someone who was here the last time we did this, before they talked a lot about K-12 and higher ed. You've done that, but you've added in a third piece, which is the employers today. Mm-hmm. And that may be what distinguishes this in some place. In some ways, it's more of a triumvirate than it was before.
Yeah. And we can get some testimony from some of the business groups if we think that.
It wasn't discussed before, but I think that it's becoming much more evident in this group.
Once again, I guess God put me here for a purpose, and it's to give all of y'all like a rash. So we no longer have a system of public higher education in the state of Texas. The Texas legislature funds on the average of 34% of the cost of higher education.
For universities, yes.
For universities. Mm-hmm. So when I grew up, there was a system of public higher education, and I was able to matriculate in the hub of the plains at Lubbock. You can probably tell by my outfit. But we don't have that anymore. So where does the money come from? Well, it comes from research grants, it comes from foundations, it comes from companies, it comes from friends, and it comes from alumni. So if we look at our corporations today in Texas, and we look at capital campaigns for institutions, because we go 6 years without getting a bill through the legislature that allows for the construction of new facilities, or there is a 50-50 private-public mix, that's coming a lot from corporations, businesses, and foundations affiliated with businesses. We look at the scholarship programs. I think the research would show the same. When we look at employment needs, the company I just retired from has created, even though David said there are 1 million welders who are available for work, we have created a welders academy that we are paying for, providing the faculty for, and the location in Harris County. So I think when you start with something, maybe what we have not clearly defined is that there already is a great deal of business involvement in our system of higher education, and so maybe we need to ascertain exactly what that involvement is before we say you must do more because the state has chosen to do less. Sorry if I get a little defensive.
This is why we've missed you so much. I just want to clarify, and when I was talking about industry, I meant employers in terms of really understanding what is needed. And so, for example, in the case of welders, there's probably something that those welders that are available can't do that you need to train them to do on top of it. And those are things that we could do better to understand.
Well, and that, I think Kathy does raise some data points. Maybe Susan's going to talk about them, but that's his understanding the trends in higher education funding between the state and the student and third parties. And also, how do you measure cost, full-time equivalent, which has been traditional, or do you move to cost per completion? And one thing I didn't mention this morning in the testimony, which I had, I think, mentioned here before, is you get 3 degrees in Florida for $100,000, and you get 1.8 in Texas. So we need to have some understanding probably why that gap is. There might be a good understanding in terms of the nature of the degrees that are being given, but that's measuring it per completion and not full-time equivalent. So,
and I'm going to kind of give multiple data sources. Each of you will notice at your place there is a big document, and that is the latest higher ed, Texas Higher Ed Almanac, and I don't have one. All right, hold it up. There you go. It has a lot of information about all of the public universities and colleges in Texas. In the front part of that, it also has a lot of information on national comparisons. And for the first time this year, there is a graph, some pages in there on workforce and how our students are doing coming out of the workforce in, I don't know, 10 different areas. And it's first year, third year, fifth year, eighth year, and 10th year earnings based on level of degrees, that sort of thing. So there is some workforce data in there for the first time, and we are getting ready to put out a website and start really promoting it. We launched it, and then we had browser issues where some browsers couldn't see it at all and some saw versions of it. And so we think we have those all taken care of at this point, and we're about to launch it again so that institutions, students can look up information by program, by institution on earnings, and it has average loan amounts at different institutions and at different levels. And so that's something that we're going to be promoting. Thank you, Houston Endowment. Actually, that was Texas Cruise, and so that comes from it's actually a joint program with the Coordinating Board and the Texas Workforce Commission, where we've been pulling together that. So, for the Almanac, thank you very much. It actually has some of the other information. It has the 8th grade cohort, where you look at the 8th graders and track them all the way through higher ed, 6-year graduation rate at higher ed. So there's a lot of information in there. So I wanted to make you aware of that. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, and we started this conversation last time, and it's some of the terminology. And we talked about certificates versus certification versus what is included for OECD OCED.
OECD.
Had it right the first time. OECD, and they talk about what we call tertiary degree, which is the highest degree for that particular field. A little harder to get to, but that's what they talk about. So they talk about academic higher ed, and they talk about the doctoral degree. Vocational ed, they'll talk about certification or certificate. And so that is the highest degree for a lot of those vocational programs. And then, so that's a little bit of a difference. They talk about certification, those are workforce certifications. Some of them are you get that certification and it's good for a lifetime. Some of them you have to continue to prove. You have to either do continuing ed, you have to retake your certification. It's only good for a 2 to 5 year time frame. That is different than a certificate. A certificate is an educational thing that is earned, and that's it. You've got it. We have something that we'll be putting on the website that kind of has a little bit, it'll be available for y'all to look at in case you get into the confused area again. And it talks about the certificate being more going through and completing a series of courses. And the certification is usually you pass this test, you earn this certification. It's most of the time, or a lot of times it's used for technology, you'll have a Unix certification, or we use SAS here, so you'll have a SAS certification. It is kind of a certification saying you know how to do this. We don't care how you got there, you know how to do this. And some of that is kind of being talked about in terms of competency-based and in getting what they call badges, saying, okay, you got this skill, this skill, this skill. And they're calling it badges that they're talking about maybe putting together. So that was something else we're going to be putting out. It may have, I don't know if that was helpful, but that's kind of the differences in how those two terms are used. One is more workforce-oriented. Now, we'll get into the real confusing. Sometimes certificates follow a certification. So sometimes an institution or community college will award a certificate based on you completing that certification. So they'll teach you what you need to get the certification, but they'll award a certificate at the same time, along whether or not you pass that test to get the certification. It is most helpful to pass that test. So those are some of the...
To add a little bit to the confusion, a certificate awarded by a community college in Texas may in fact be different, means something different than one in California, New Hampshire, New Jersey. And so that's one reason some of the national data comparisons are challenging, because you don't know precisely what it means when a student receives a certificate from state to state.
Dr. Gardner, would that be like English 202 at a community college and English 202 at a university or college?
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
So that, again, that goes back to something else. Right now I'm going to actually pull up a little demonstration. We're just in the process of getting this ready. We think it will help us a little bit further down the line. This is something that will look familiar to some of you who were saw the NCHIMS had a thing. This is looking at, and this is something we're working on for you. And this is 30% educational attainment. We've got some wording that needs to be changed. But we have high school graduation rates. And we're going to divide it by economically disadvantaged, non-economically disadvantaged. This shows kind of where some stop-out points are. This shows the additional undergraduate credentials. Right now, this shows if all things stayed the same, how many additional degrees. Do not look at the numbers. They are not correct numbers. We're still running some of this data. But this is going to be a tool that we think that you can use on where you can make the most difference. So if you increase the graduation rate of your economically disadvantaged, you're going to get more degrees being awarded. And this is this college going directly from high school. You can see the numbers will change. 20 to 39-year-old, if you get more of those students in college, you're going to increase your degrees. If you increase your graduation rate, this is that emerging research for either economically and non-economically, public two-year, other colleges. You can see where it's going to increase. So this is a way of saying, okay, here's how we can try to move forward, and where we have some of those breaks, and so this is strictly a let you see one of the things we're working on that you will be able to use as a tool for where you want to focus attention moving forward.
Yeah, this isn't to provide an answer to you, but all of these things we know contribute somehow to having an educated workforce and producing graduates. But at some point, it tells you which one of these can make the most difference. And you might make some decisions in terms of the strategies you pick based upon this analysis. But that's still your decision to weigh that out. There'll be some things that may not play out quite as well here, but you think is still important to do.
This also ties, if you scroll down, it ties to change in personal income per capita. So if you increase your number of degrees per personal income per capita, will increase additional state tax dollars. You'll get more revenue if you're getting a more educated populace, additional dollars, and then state costs per revenue generated. We're still working on getting some of this data. These are some of the breakouts that we're having. We are focusing on the economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged because we understand that a lot of this is, yes, the minorities are more higher represented in the lower income, but we need to help everybody that's in that low income to get into higher ed and to move on through the process. So that's how come we've got it broken out this way. We're going to be adding, and if there are things that you think are really important points that we need to add, we'll try and get the data and pull it into this so that we can kind of focus on how all of this is working.
So, Susan, are you going to be able to make this available in such a way that the members of the committee can reach this from their homes, or are they going to have to utilize it here alone?
We will be sending it out.
Okay.
Once we get all the data pulled together. Like I said, we're still working on it. We don't even have all the data this way. We have bits and pieces of it. We've got a working kind of behind the scenes right now to calculate the data to at least get us to where are we currently so that we know if nothing else changes and we stay where we're at, where are we going to be? And so those are some of the things. And we're looking at some trend data so that if we follow the same trend, where will we be at that point? And this is just going to be a tool for y'all to be able to use where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. So, and I think that's about all I had. Are there any questions about?
But I could suggest if you look at this at home and questions occur to you that aren't being answered, jot it down because you may forget it. But those are the types of things that we'd like to be able to answer the questions for you. Yes, sir.
So is this a web tool that we're going to use, or is this a software package?
This is actually all done in Excel at this point.
Okay.
Staff.
It's a very standard.
Everything are in there.
Everything is in Excel at this point.
Yeah. Susan's staff developed this in about 3 weeks. So they're modeling it after.
We developed this
another group looks like nationally, but it's our data, and they've developed it in concordance. So Mr. Hunt had mentioned he'd like to have a tool like this, and so we developed it for you.
Wait for that word.
Yes, sir.
We're looking at percentages here, but do we have any statistics that show the numbers of students that are online in the public schools by grade level? As an example, how many students are in the first grade, second grade, third grade?
We do have that.
And then from the 12th grade, what number come to the public schools, to the community colleges and universities?
Yes, and that is actually where we receive, what we do is we have this high school graduation rates, which we don't have it broken out this way for a long enough trend yet, and we're working on that. But this college going directly from high school, that actually comes from, will come from some of the data that we get from TEA. And so we'll have that based on whether they're economically or non-economically disadvantaged. We get that information from TEA. Then we also know for those that are coming and they're first-time entering students, how many are graduating, whether they're economically, non-economically disadvantaged, the number of graduates. There are some things that we haven't yet figured out how to build into this, which are the students who start part-time and how that breaks out and how they go as we continue on to get the number of degrees. And so we're still refining this, shall we say, but we are working on moving forward to be able to provide that information.
Now, Ramon, what we would hope to be able to do is to build a model here that, starting with Dr. Murdoch's projections on populations for, say, 2030, calculation out of that of what's the size of the workforce. From there, make some judgment on what percentage of that workforce we think needs to have higher education attainment, and then ask ourselves how much of it do we think might come from immigration, how much of it might come from adults returning, in other words, over 25 that are coming back to get some type of certification or degree, and then that leaves us with what do our institutions need to produce. And essentially, we could solve for a compounding rate. If we're at 240,000 today, what would we need to be in 2030? Is that a 4% growth rate or a 6% growth rate? And then if immigration drops in half, what does that do to our growth rate? How much does it have to go up? If we can't bring adults back into the system and get then what does that do? Or if we're more successful in either one of those. So essentially, that's kind of a model that we're hoping that we can build to at least have some sense of what the possibilities are, and is it realistic or not. And I think we still need a lot of dialogue around what the goals are. I mean, the 60% to me sounds a little bit like the 5.7% that was set in the 2000. And so you're setting something, but you're 15 years away from it happening. So how realistic is it when you actually get there? Another way to go would be to say we want to compete with these 10 states or these 15 states. And so we want to be in the top 10 or the top 15 states, or we could pick some benchmark countries and we could have a composite there, and then it becomes a moving average. You would know today we're here, and every year you'd be remeasuring and you were seeing, are we closing the gap or is the gap getting wider? So I think there's a lot of dialogue that still probably needs to take place about how do we benchmark ourselves. One thing I'm convinced of, it needs to be tied to the workforce, because I think that's where we get the political support for change and resources, because we can connect the workforce to our incomes, which go back to our ability to pay taxes and support the investments. So it's a circular argument there that hopefully would be persuasive, at least to enough to be able to move policy and resources. Okay, Susan.
All right.
Do you have anything else, or does that conclude?
That concludes mine, and now I think Dominic is going to provide us information.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Dominic Chavez, I'm the Director of External Relations here at the Higher Education Coordinating Board, and I was asked to come give a brief overview of some tools and perhaps opportunities that this committee can leverage to really ensure that we collect input from throughout the state, from stakeholders and the general public, in terms of helping inform this process, getting feedback on the framework that this committee is going to be working on over the next 12 to 15 months as you develop the next long-range plan for higher education. So what I was going to do was broadly talk about perhaps throw more food for thought, because I think this committee will have to think about the different tools and options they have available to determine which is appropriate to solicit feedback. So I want to provide some of that food for thought today for you to think on as you go forward. In general, I think what we've heard both in discussions with the legislature, in talking to members of the legislature in their offices, talking with stakeholders and local chambers as we were soliciting input and nominations for this committee, I think what we heard over and over again is a desire that we provide is broad outreach during this process as we can and cast a very wide net. In fact, just this morning I was meeting with representatives from the Metro 8 chambers, briefing them on the status of this committee, and they've been aware since we asked many of them to suggest names to serve on this committee for the business community. And I think there was absolutely a desire from them to perhaps, for this group to take up the tent stakes and perhaps, if options that are available, move around the state and perhaps hold town halls or solicit feedback from various regions. That may or may not be possible. That's something, again, food for thought. They thought that would be something that might be useful to their members at the chambers and to their local communities as an opportunity to plug in more directly to this process if and when appropriate. So just some things to think about. What I was specifically going to talk about today was one tool that the coordinating board has purchased, if you will. We have a contract with a company called Mind Mixer, which specializes, particularly on the government sector side, works with local jurisdictions, municipalities, as well as state government, state agencies, in terms of providing what they call an online engagement tool. It's specifically designed for those entities to solicit feedback on very specific initiatives or policy issues, to hear from the general public so they can use that as part of their public outreach and public input process. So I was going to provide a couple quick slides here. It's a little awkward. I'm going to have to speak with it to my back. But what we have developed working with Mind Mixer is what we're calling College Town Hall Texas. And we launched this about a year ago in anticipation. I think not only we're using it for some of our programs here at the coordinating board, our program directors use this as a tool to communicate with some of their stakeholders, but in anticipation, obviously, of this effort, knowing that we were going to want to reach out to the general public to get feedback on the next higher education plan, that we thought this might be an important tool or one tool in our toolkit to utilize. And what College Town Hall Texas is, it's a customizable online engagement platform, again, created by a company called Mind Mixer. And again, this is mostly used by governmental entities to solicit feedback. Basically, what College Town Hall Texas allows you to do is it leverages a lot of the existing social media networks that are already out there. So it allows users who are using things like LinkedIn, Twitter feedback, Facebook, Google Connect, and some of those other social media platforms that are out there, to use those to also interact with this website. But users can also sign up for this website as a standalone engagement tool. And this just basically shows you that interface. One of the things that, and I'm going to, once I finish through these next couple slides, I'm going to pull a Susan and go over there and give you a quick demo of the site. But one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next 12 to 15 months and is focused on marketing this tool as far and wide as we can as a way for the public to engage in this process. And again, one of the ways we'll do that, we'll work through our communications office to reach out with regional newspapers and other publications to make them aware of the site, see if we can get some kind of public service announcement, free of charge publication in these newspapers to promote the site, and this is an opportunity for the public to weigh in on this planning process. We'll obviously also use our existing social media infrastructure here at the agency to promote it. Certainly work with our partner agencies like TEA and the Texas Workforce Commission, who they themselves, with their stakeholders, have very large networks. Obviously, our institutions of higher education are also in that mix. They have very large networks that we'll work with them to try to promote access to this site and receive input. And then certainly work with our chambers of commerce, business organizations, and nonprofits to make sure that their networks are aware that this opportunity is available to them. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to step over here. So as you can see here, this is the front page, if you will, for College Town Hall, Texas. And again, the way the site works is it is a subscription-based site, if you will. As some of you know, with modern newspapers online and some other bulletin boards online, you can often have people provide anonymous feedback. They can go on and just drop comments, and there's very little opportunity to make sure that those comments are appropriate. What MindMixer has done since they've been in this business, they've recognized that the way you get the high-quality feedback, feedback that's actually going to be worthwhile and that's going to actually serve a purpose, is to actually require members to do a short subscription. And they don't require much. They literally ask you for a name and a password. But what they found was that kind of discourages kind of the random comments, boy, I don't like that guy Dominic at the coordinating board, why does he still have a job type feedback that's not going to be useful. So this is something, again, this is the way this infrastructure is designed. This was not the coordinating board decision, but MindMixer, who's been in this business of online engagement tools and how this has worked with other entities, has found that having that function in there actually filters out some of the chaff, if you will, to make sure that you actually do get high quality feedback. So users will have to sign in and provide some basic information to be a member of the site and to participate. As you can see, I've provided just a couple of examples here, and I'm going to go ahead and log in with my username and password here. And as you can see, a user doesn't have to create their own account. They can also use an existing, if they have an existing Facebook or Google or LinkedIn, they can use those usernames and passwords to sign into the site. So as a member of this site, and I've provided just a couple of examples here that we'll be pulling down, but I just wanted to show you the different types of questions you can solicit from the public. But you have a couple different options. You can ask very open-ended questions and ask people just to provide free-flow responses. So, for example, one of the topics that we have here is, what goals and objectives or metrics should be included in the next Texas higher education plan. And again, there's no specific, it's not asking them to choose an option, it's asking them to provide a free-flowed response. Which may be useful, so more qualitative, if you will. When you post these topics, you can provide, again, we provided some basic information about the topic, to give some context and background for the user. You can link websites, you can upload video, you can upload documents. For example, if there was a draft white paper that this committee had put together, we could load it up to the website so that as people try to answer these questions or provide feedback, they have access to the documents. We would certainly direct them to a website on our page where we're posting some of the documents and agendas for this committee so that if they wanted more information before they provided feedback, they could get that. And it's all going to be at their fingertips here as they log on to the site. So that's one of the benefits of this. In addition to a kind of a free-flowing, open-ended question, you can also ask very specific questions and kind of almost in a survey type approach. And again, this is just something we threw up there. We'll pull this down, but it was just for example purposes. What role should a STEM-related goal metric play in the next long-range plan? And a user has to select one or the other, or one only gets to select one of these options. But they can also share. It'll also give them an opportunity to share comments as well if they wanted to share comments. But this may be a way to collect more quantitative feedback. Of the 200 or so people that have provided input, 150 of them have suggested that STEM should be a major goal. That's the type of response or feedback you'd get from this type of approach. So again, this is highly customizable. We can arrange these questions any way that the committee thinks is appropriate. We can shape them in any way they think is appropriate. Ultimately, it will be a decision of this committee to decide what things to ask of the public, what things you want to get feedback from the public on, and we can obviously, from a coordinating board staff standpoint, we can shape the site accordingly. So again, we just wanted to briefly show you this tool. It is at your disposal for if and when you think appropriate. It may be something that we do different things with it as we go through the process. And again, we have the capabilities, I think, to market this as far and wide as we can. And again, this is just one tool. I think you wouldn't want to rely on just this online engagement tool as the way you're getting input from the community. You may want to think again about other opportunities, whether it's town halls around the state or other types of options available, so that the public and other stakeholders feel they have a stake, if you will, in this process. Because as you know, that was one of the strengths of the original Closing the Gaps plan, was that many hands and voices help shape it, many hands and voices help kind of push it along, and we want to make sure this plan does that as well. Yes, David?
You haven't addressed, I think, a main concern I would have as a member of the committee. How would I actually use this? You showed earlier a screen in which so here's who's listening. How would members of this committee how would they use this themselves? Is there a specific way that they would go online and read responses?
Yeah, it could be a couple different ways. All the responses that are posted on these, and I'll just give you an example of a topic that's actually live and operating today. It's not related to, obviously, this effort, but let me see here. So this is an issue that that we're using in another issue for the agency. And as you can see, for example, here is one response, and a particular person left a comment. So all these comments are posted in real time, so that a member of this committee, if we did post a particular question, let's say it was an open-ended question, any member of this committee could come to this site, and you wouldn't even necessarily have to log on. You come to the site, and you could see all the responses in real time that have been posted. So certainly if you wanted to do that real time, you could do that. We could also, I think what we'd anticipate doing in terms of supporting this committee is if there was a specific question to be asked, I would submit to you that we could kind of compile all those in a more digestible report and provide it to the committee. So I think there's a couple different options for which we can collect this information and report it back to you. You can monitor it real time, or we can compile it into a nice report for you, and or probably both, I imagine. Did that answer your question, David?
Yes, Lionel.
In terms of who's giving this this information, how is it that we qualify people to be the people that we want to hear from?
Well, yeah, this is a double-edged sword. Again, by virtue of requiring them to create an account, to basically say, here's my email address and I have a username and password to sign on, we feel like you would be eliminating some of the people who probably wouldn't have very positive influence, because they're taking the time to actually sign up to provide input. But other than that, anyone can sign on to the site. So it is a public forum. There's really no way for us to deny access, if you will, to a particular person that wants to sign on and provide comment. So that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's wide open and you get comments from everybody. On the other side, you get comments from everybody, right?
So if we spend time on questions, should we spend time on who, by category, it would be helpful to hear from? And then in some instances with associations that could send this out, parenting organizations, others, we could do an electronic invitation or a text invitation. I'm more concerned about identifying voices that will be helpful to us, as well as the right questions, and getting that input. So is there a way we could consider, through some partnerships, these invitations?
Absolutely, and I think that would probably produce the greatest amount of quality input, and I certainly expect we would do that. For example, meeting with the representatives from Metro 8, they were very interested in perhaps using a tool like this where they could send it to their members and say, okay, the Strategic Planning Committee is asking this question about workforce and education. Here's the link. Please provide feedback. Now, again, the challenge there is when, let's say, a member of the Dallas Chamber, let's say their education committee, decides to come on the website and register and provide feedback, unless they specifically put in their comments, I'm a member of the Dallas Regional Chamber and here's my feedback, you wouldn't necessarily know whether that,
Right. No,
so,
I understand
perfect.
that, but
Yep.
what I'm trying to do is not run the table, but I'm trying to do some things to open quote, motivate, close quote, publics that could be helpful to the committee in making it easier for them to be aware and possibly participate.
Certainly, yes.
Is there a way for the commentator to list their credential, either have a drop down, either an organization or public member?
Let me check. There are some fields, and I'll have to go back and check, and I'll get back to the committee on this. And they're constantly upgrading this system, and so there may be ways that they can. Again, they try to customize it based on the people who are paying for the service. There's a potential for that. The challenge is they have to opt to do that. If they for whatever reason say I don't want to tell you who I am, then we can't. It's not like you can deny them the system or they can't sign up. So we can check on that to see if there's a way that we can encourage people to self-identify.
Just a little bit, I
yeah.
think. I am a parent. I am an educator. I am a business owner. I am a community involved.
Counselor.
A counselor, yeah. Some kind of just general categories
Right.
would certainly be. This is what teachers are thinking. This is what students are thinking. This is what parents are thinking. I think that would be very helpful, and I think anybody that's interested enough to give us feedback wouldn't mind giving us just a teeny bit of without infringing on their privacy.
Well, here's one option, just as you're talking about that we may want to think about, and this will be we can go back and talk to the Mind Mixer people and see how we can make this work for the intention for what I'm hearing. But one of the things that they do have is the ability to solicit input based on groups. So they have something that's called a participant group. And what a participant group is, you can actually manage, so you can't deny people if they want to sign up, but what you can do is you can send out invitations to a select group of people. So, for example, this T-STEM Administration Interest Group, this is one of the programs we have here at the Core Name Board, and there's 23 individuals that the program director identified as wanting to be involved in sharing feedback for this particular group. Now, what they did was that we had to manually input those email addresses, and it would send out an invitation to just those members, and those are the only people who can actually share and participate in that group. So as I'm just thinking out loud here, and we'll explore this, that perhaps if there was a way of working with some of these interest groups like whether it's TASA or TASB or the Chamber, if there was a way that we could perhaps customize one of these participant groups and ask very targeted questions, and we might be able to control for that a little bit, but I will need to work with the Mind Mixer people to see whether how much we can go, how far we can go with that.
I was just thinking that.
Any more questions for Dominic?
They must not be from Texas.
Dominic, any more to add, or is that?
No, I think that's it. Again, that we'll follow up on some of these questions and see how we can customize it. Again, I think ultimately what we'll be looking for guidance from this committee is, what do you want to ask of the public or stakeholders using this tool or anything else? When do you want to ask it? And again, how do you want us to report those results? I think those will be kind of the guidance that we're going to eventually need if you think this is a tool that's going to be useful for this committee. And that's something for perhaps a future meeting.
Woody, I have a comment. One of the common themes of all three of the breakout session groups was business involvement. And I would think that whether it's virtually or whether it's physically face-to-face of gathering input from other interested people, it seems to me that rather than our coming to them or the coordinating board coming to them, whether it's chambers of commerce or whatever, we should, in my opinion, offer an invitation to the chambers of commerce, because every community, large and small, has a chamber, and let them tell us. In other words, give them the ownership, because they're the ones that are the business and community leadership. And if they're saying, we want to know what you're doing, and we want you to come to us, whether virtually or in person, obviously can't go to every community, but that seems like it would give them skin in the game or ownership.
Okay, very good. David, one thought is whether we should have some input from the economics profession in two regards. I mean, one is who do we as an economic unit, being the state of Texas, who do we do business with? I mean, who are our top 10, whether they be states or whether they be countries? That might begin to help give us some guidance on, because we'll know who we compete with, might give us some guidance on looking at their higher education attainment. The other is, as I know there's some studies been done, and Larry is probably familiar with some of them, on the return on higher education expenditures. So, I mean, it's an economic model that maybe the return is delayed, but on a present value basis, it can be still a high rate of return. So I don't know whether we have those that are already on board or whether we would want to take testimony along those lines. But that's another part of the equation out here. In other words, does it pay for itself?
It's up to your discretion. Lots of institutions have do those studies periodically. The Community College Association contracts with someone that does those nationally, and they've done that in Texas. Actually, the Texas Faculty Association did that once. I know that University of Houston got a lot of splash with one they did 3 years ago. I would be stunned if UT Austin hasn't done one at some point. We can bring those together. The interesting thing is you can almost say what they're going to say, but I think it's important to repeat it. I mean, I could say without doing a study that the return will be a minimum of $3 for one, and it could be as high, depending on who does the study, as 15 or 20. But I think you can almost say with certainty that it's going to be $3. But there are people who do that. There was an individual at either University of Arizona or Arizona State that actually had a book. It's a number of years ago. I don't know if he's still active. Who had actually reviewed these studies from across the country. I think if nothing else, you'd want to be aware of it, and it may be something in the final plan that you might at least want to make some reference to. So we can look into that.
The more
back when I actually talked.
Yeah, the more independent it is, the more independent. Larry mentioned the Federal Reserve. I mean, it could be the more independent it is, the better. And obviously, ourselves, since even though we have institutional representatives or past representatives, we're a pretty neutral body here. So hopefully, that gives us some legitimacy to, if we think that's an important part of the final report, to be able to reference or to recommend.
And I would add to your question about who does Texas really do business with. We might also want to add, who do we want to do business with that we're not. Mm-hmm. And this reflects a little bit. I think I still want to remind everyone of Dr. Faulkner's comment earlier. I think some of this is unpredictable, and what we want to be doing is, and to use Laurie's word, nimble, which I think is actually a good word in this context, is I think you're probably wanting to develop a state in which you've produced graduates that are nimble enough to be prepared for whatever that future might be. Not simply the future we can imagine now, but the one that it may actually become. And so we've come up, you've produced a lot of good things for us to follow up on today. So we will summarize these and get them to you and first of next week.
Yeah.
So some at least summary of what you've discussed and some possibilities. I think you've put us in the position that we probably can start at least the skeletal planning for meetings through August, what they might be as a point of your consideration. And I want to mention to Dr. Ferguson, that at least we noticed the comment on the faculty, and I'm going to mention to our staff putting together that meeting in delivery systems in July that it would be good if somebody at least addressed the issue of will the role of the faculty change in some ways given new delivery systems, which I think was your point.
Okay, well,
Noted.
we're ahead of schedule here, so this is a good time. It's not bad to be ahead of schedule, and we will end early, but I want to make sure that everyone has had an opportunity to give us their input. So, okay. Well, thank you very much for, once again, spending your time in the service of your state. And we will see everybody in May for what should be a very interesting, given the quality of the inputs there, very interesting meeting. Thank you.